Well, hello and welcome. In this episode, we're going to take a look at two separate Bible passages. The first is Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. The second is John chapter 11, verses 1 to 45. These are longer passages, and so we're going to take a look at them through one particular lens. We're going to spend some time thinking about the agony and glory of waiting. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and open it up first to Mark chapter 5, and let's dive in. Now, this passage, Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21, is one of my very favorites in all of the scriptures. But before we get into it, we need to set the context just a little bit. A couple of videos ago, we spent some time talking about the Gerasene demoniac, the man with the legion of demons. And we noted that Jesus sailed across the sea to have this encounter with this one man. He heals him, gets back in his boat, and sails back across the sea. And it's when he arrives back on the other side that he has the encounter that begins in verse 21. This is what Mark writes. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And Jesus went with him. Now, there's a couple things worth noting here. First of all, the man knows Jesus is coming. His name is Jairus, and he's a synagogue ruler. He's not the sort of person that often in scriptures runs to Jesus' feet in front of a crowd and falls at his feet. In fact, he's a synagogue ruler. He wouldn't have run, period. He certainly wouldn't have fallen at someone's feet, and definitely not a wandering rabbi from Nazareth. And yet, he is desperate. Mark tells us that he closes the distance between himself and Jesus, that he runs up right to him, that he falls at his feet, and that he begs Jesus to come with him. There's a level of desperation because his daughter is sick, and Jesus obliges, goes with him. Mark continues, a great crowd followed him and thronged about Jesus. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. This is a woman who has suffered significantly for a long period of time. A flow of blood would have cut her off from the religious community. She would have been perpetually unclean, unable to participate in the religious life of the time, the social life of the time. She had suffered a great deal at the hands of doctors. She'd gone to anybody she could, and for 12 years had only gotten worse. 12 years is a long time to wait. But verse 27, she'd heard the reports about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I'll be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself the power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" Of course, Jesus' question is ridiculous. Jesus, there's a throng of people all around you. Everybody is touching you. And yet Jesus knew this touch was different. And so he stops and he looked around to see who had done it. That's verse 32. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. She begins afraid. Surely this all is too good to be true, and yet there's something about Jesus that makes her feel like she can come to his feet, draw near to him. Just like Jairus, she falls down before him, and then she tells him the whole truth. The whole truth is a long story. 12 years of story, 12 years of pain, 12 years of suffering, 12 years of false promises from doctors and healers, 12 years of being cut off from the religious and social life, 12 years of pain and agony, and Jesus listens to it all. I wonder what it must have felt like for her in that moment to be recognized, to be seen, to have her story heard, this nameless outcast of a woman, to be seen and known by Jesus. And then Jesus said to her, "Daughter, Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Not only does Jesus see her, hear her own story, he calls her daughter. He sends her away in peace. We've said this before, Jesus is interested in holistic healing, body, mind, spirit, soul, and he does it all here. She's physically healed. She's emotionally healed. She's called daughter, welcomed back in, seen, known, loved, and healed. Now, while Jesus was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Can you imagine in this moment what it might have been like to be Jairus? You've done everything right. You've humbled yourself before the teacher. You've thrown yourself at his feet. You've placed your trust in him. And it seems like he's going to answer your prayer. But on the way to answering your prayer, he's waylaid by someone who suffered for 12 years. Surely she could wait a little bit longer. And Jesus dawdles enough, if you will. He hears her whole story, and while Jesus stops and pauses to hear her whole story, Jairus' daughter dies. I wonder what that must have felt like for Jairus to see this woman's prayer answered while his own goes unanswered. Have you ever felt like that before? Like Jesus is answering everyone else's prayers around you but your own? The sinking in his gut. I did it right. And yet, it's not enough. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Oh, those are words for people who are hurting and afraid, who are lost and broken. Don't be afraid, just believe. And Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years old. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. A bleeding woman suffering for 12 years is healed and restored. A little girl who's 12 years old is healed and restored. Both instances, Jesus goes above and beyond, and he meets all of their needs. There's a couple of really cool things that happen here in the back end of this story. It's always worth, in the Bible, paying attention to proximity and posture, and this is particularly true in the Gospel of Mark. So if you think about this story, think about proximity and posture as it relates to Jesus. Jairus closes the proximity. He runs to Jesus and he falls at his feet, posture. And Jesus responds to him and goes with him. Likewise, the bleeding woman draws close to Jesus, proximity, falls at his feet, posture. On the flip side, you've got these people who are making a loud commotion. They laugh when Jesus says, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of this." And what does Jesus do? We see it right here in verse 40. Jesus puts them outside. The proximity lengthens because of their lack of faith. Meanwhile, Peter, James, John, Jairus, and the girl's mother, they stay close to Jesus. Proximity. It's a tool that Mark uses to speak to heart posture. Those who are physically close to Jesus are close to Jesus. Those whose hearts are hard towards Jesus end up physically far from Jesus. Second, God always works on his terms and his timeline. You've got a woman who waited 12 years. And God could have healed her along the way in those 12 years. He certainly could have done it through one of those doctors. And yet he doesn't. He works on his own terms and his own timeline. And as a result, this woman has an encounter with Jesus that changes everything for her. Likewise, Jesus delays. He doesn't get to Jairus' house as fast as he could. And because of it, the girl dies. And yet, Jesus works on his own terms and his own timeline. And as a result, Jairus and his household gets to see her raised from the dead. And that brings me to my third point. The result of God's work is almost always different than what we could imagine. But because God is God, it is always better than we could imagine. I'm going to go ahead and say that again. The result is almost always different than we imagine, but because God is God, it is always better than we imagine. The woman, her story is heard. She's called daughter. She has an encounter with Jesus that changes everything. Jairus, it seems like all is lost, and yet he has this encounter with Jesus where his daughter is raised from the dead. It's different than he had imagined. There is no categories for resurrection. He couldn't have imagined that possibility. And yet, it is better than they might otherwise have imagined. Friends, you might be waiting for God to answer a prayer. And these stories remind us God works on his own terms and his own timeline. They remind us how even in the waiting, it is good to stay close to Jesus, to keep your heart posture soft towards him. And it reminds us that when it comes to our life with God, the result is almost always different than we could imagine. But because God is God, it's also better than we might otherwise imagine. That's part one. We're going to see the same themes turn up in John chapter 11, so I'm going to invite you to turn there with me. This is the story of the death and resurrection of Lazarus. It's a long text. I'm going to pull out a few highlights, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was a Mary who had anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to Jesus, saying, "Lord, he whom you love," that is, Lazarus, "is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. This doesn't make sense. Lazarus is sick. Mary and Martha do everything right. They send for Jesus. "Jesus, we know illness isn't a problem for you." And Jesus loves them. John tells us that several times here, and yet he waits. He delays 2 days longer. Verse 7, then after this he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews you were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, but because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." After saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover." If he's just asleep, it's not that big a deal, right, Jesus? Now Jesus, though, verse 13, had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest in sleep. And then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us go also, that we may die with him." Now Jesus, in order to get to his friend Lazarus, has to go through the very territory of the people who are trying to kill him. But he's going to do it. He's going to go see his friend, even though his friend has died. Now, picking up at verse 17, John writes, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Martha, you can hear the hurt in her voice. "Jesus, why didn't you come? Why did you delay? If you hadn't delayed, my brother would still be alive." And yet at the same time, you hear the faith. Verse 22, "But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Martha is holding together both her pain, her struggle to understand, and her faith together. And friends, this is how Jesus wants us to come to him, holding our pain and our doubt, bringing those to him, even as we hold them together with our faith. Jesus responds to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the dead." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." Now, Martha, she doesn't have categories for this sort of raising from the dead. She knows that the dead will be raised the last day, but she can't imagine that her brother Lazarus would be raised now, and yet still she clings to Jesus, confessing that he is the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Now, when Martha had said this, she went and called her sister Mary in private, saying, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." When she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Can you hear the agony? "Jesus, why did you delay?" It's coming from Mary just as it's coming from Martha. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, Jesus was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" 3 times that same question. "Jesus, if you had just come, he wouldn't have died." It's a fair question. "Jesus, why are you leaving us in our pain? Why are you making us wait for something?" And I love the way that Jesus responds. He's not cold to them. He's not indifferent. He knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He's already told his disciples so, and yet still here he weeps. He joins them in their grief. And this is such a poignant, potent image for us. We live in a world that's broken and full of darkness and sin and pain and grief and death and dying. And here in Jesus, he's holding together both his own power. He knows he's going to raise him from the dead. I am the resurrection of the life, even as he grieves. He names both of those things, the future hope and the present pain, just as Martha does. And for us in this world that's full of death and dying and darkness and pain, it's an invitation for us to grieve with Jesus, even as we, with Jesus, hold on to hope in the waiting. These two things are not separate. Grieving is not a sign of lack of faith. Bringing your pain, your agony, your doubts to Jesus, it's not a sign of lack of faith. Rather, it is a sign of faith. We believe enough, Jesus, to bring you this hurt, trusting that you alone have the power to do something with us, to do something with it. And friends, it's the proper thing to do with our grief and our pain, to bring it to Jesus. He's the only one big enough to handle it. Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Martha is so practical. Jesus, it's going to stink a little bit. But Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" It's that same instruction. Don't be afraid, just believe. And so they took away the stone. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around me, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said those things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet unbound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Friends, as we get towards the end here, there's a few observations I'd like to make. First, Jesus is not indifferent to the suffering and grief that often accompanies waiting. He's not indifferent to the suffering and grief that often accompanies waiting. Instead, he enters into it. Second, Jesus doesn't waste any of it. He is in the business of redeeming it. And third, if God really does redeem our waiting, then it means that the best is yet to come. And it is far better than we could ask or imagine. Certainly that's true for Mary and Martha and Lazarus here. God redeems their waiting. He redeems their pain, even as Jesus enters into it with them. And the outcome? Something far better than they could ask or imagine. Now I've got some questions for further discussion here. I'll pop up at the end of this video. If this was helpful for you, please do share, subscribe, like, comment, and we'll see you next time.